Hello and welcome to another cybersecurity podcast. I have with me Rob Jervis, our Chief Technology Officer, and we're going to be talking about cloud security assessments. So, welcome, Rob.
Hello, welcome. Thank you.
So, should we start by defining what we mean by cloud then? So, what we don't mean by cloud is a visible mass of water vapor in the. Do you know much about that kind of cloud?
Not about that
All
kind of
right, we'll
cloud,
we'll
I'm
leave
afraid.
that then. We'll just talk about cloud computing. So I read on the I was just doing a bit of research on definitions of cloud. The International Organization for Standardization (ISO) they define cloud as scalable and elastic pool of shareable physical or virtual resources. Bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
It is a little bit of a mouthful, yeah.
So how do we simplify that?
So I think fundamentally for most people, when they think about cloud, they're
Mm,
talking about putting their data or their systems out on the internet.
yeah.
So into what they term as being the cloud,
Mm,
realistically is hosting it elsewhere, normally remote from
yeah.
themselves.
Yeah. Okay. So and there's different types of cloud, isn't there? There's sort of public, private, and hybrid.
Yeah, so for sort of public cloud,
Mm,
that's probably what most people think of initially when
yeah.
we talk about cloud. So that's kind of your typical services. So the likes of Amazon's AWS,
Mm,
Microsoft's Azure services,
hmm.
those are kind of public cloud offerings.
Yeah.
Um, and then as you quite rightly say, so private cloud is sort of separate to that. That's
Mm,
generally where you're using an infrastructure that might be managed by an in-house team or possibly an external party,
hmm.
but is for your sole use. So
Yeah.
it's private to your organization, whereas a public cloud
Mm,
service is generally kind of a multi-tenant
okay.
environment.
And then a hybrid is just a kind of a combination of the two, isn't it? Really.
So when an organization's using a hybrid cloud
Mm,
sort of set of technologies, what they're really usually doing is either migrating from one position to the other. So
yeah.
maybe they've traditionally got an on-premise
Mm,
infrastructure, maybe some servers there, and they're moving those into a cloud hosted environment.
mm,
They might, for a period of time, have both sets of services running,
okay.
or some that have migrated and some that haven't. So we
Mm,
would term that kind of hybrid cloud.
mm,
Also, in some use applications, there are services that need to remain kind of on premise and
mm,
things that need to or that can be migrated. So
okay.
some organizations will run in a hybrid cloud state,
Mm,
as kind of their standard.
okay. And then the way you consume services from a cloud environment, there's the as a service model, so infrastructure, platform, software as a service. Do you want to say a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so there's kind of a range of terminology
Mm,
in there. So generally, with those sort of cloud services, you're
mm-hmm,
consuming them kind of as a subscription.
mm-hmm,
So you're using them kind of on the basis as you need to.
yeah.
The different sort of levels that you talked about, so like infrastructure as a service,
Mm,
software as a service, and platform as a service sitting there in the middle. That's kind of
mm,
about the amount of services that are provided by the cloud provider, and
mm-hmm,
then the amount that you're doing yourself.
mm-hmm,
So if you were to take a server and
mm,
migrate that into a cloud hosted
mm,
environment,
mm-hmm,
probably be using an infrastructure as a service model
okay.
where the hardware and the kind of the underlying
Mm,
sort of networking and those sorts of technologies are provided by the cloud provider.
okay.
But the sort of actual server, the operating
Mm,
system, in a software term,
mm,
you'd be maintaining yourself.
okay.
If you were to write an application
Mm,
and then run that in a cloud environment
mm-hmm,
and run that kind of on a platform,
mm-hmm,
essentially on an application service and a database backend
mm-hmm,
that are provided by the cloud provider, that would be platform as a service.
okay.
So it's sort of that next layer up where there's
Yeah.
less elements that you're responsible for, more elements that the cloud
Right.
provider is responsible for,
Mm-hmm,
and you can focus really in on the application
yeah. Yeah.
technology and the services
Mm-hmm,
rather than kind of the underlying
okay.
server
And
components.
then software as a service. It's just consuming the software that the cloud provider's written or another vendor's written.
Yeah, so software as a service, like I say, moving up that stack
Mm,
one more stage. So rather than you hosting your application,
yeah.
perhaps in a platform as a service model,
Mm-hmm,
you'd be using an application that's already written and produced. So
okay.
a typical example might be like a productivity suite,
Mm,
like Google Apps
mm,
or on Microsoft 365.
Hmm.
Those are kind of software as a service offerings where you're consuming the application
Right.
remotely.
Okay. And you sort of touched on the shared responsibility. That's quite important, isn't it? Especially when it comes to securing those environments, because the cloud provider is responsible for securing an element of that service. The clients are essentially responsible for securing the remaining components. And there's often a bit of a mismatch or a confusion, I guess, around what am I as a client responsible for, and what's the vendor responsible for?
There often is, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So the shared responsibility models of each cloud provider,
Mm,
form a good sort of reference base for
mm,
that. It depends kind of the application that you're using. So if you're
mm,
using sort of an Office 365 style suite,
mhm,
you're going to be responsible for certain components, but potentially less than if you were using, say, an infrastructure as a service
mm,
model. So
yeah.
the there's a differing amount that you're responsible for depending on the type of technology that you're using. But the key thing really to take away from that is that there is always an element of
Mm,
security that you're responsible for,
yeah.
and you need to understand how much that is
Mm,
so that you can make sure that you're doing sort of the right piece there,
yeah. Yeah.
and you understand where the demarcation is between what you're doing and then what the cloud provider is
All
doing
right.
for you.
Okay. So let's talk about security risks then, and just to lead into that, there was an interesting statistic I came across from Gartner.
Okay.
The Insight people.
Yeah.
So they say that 99% of cloud failures, security failures, are going to be down to the client. So this the client's fault this year. This is in 2025. That's an interesting stat, isn't it? Because what they're saying is that most of these security issues are going to be related to something that the client hasn't done, or they've done wrong, if you like. So that's quite showing, really, because that demonstrates that the client isn't really taking on the responsibility that they should from a cloud-based service. So just on that note, then, so just if we use that then to move into what you see as the security risks in cloud, and you and your team are sort of testing cloud environments all the time, aren't you? So what sort of things do you see that we won't talk about who's at fault here, but perhaps just relate it back to whose responsibility potentially it is to remediate those issues.
Yeah, of course. So I think one of the some of the key areas really
Mm,
are around securing services that sit in the cloud,
hmm.
through a couple of main routes really. So misconfiguration is a
Okay.
big one. So the
Mm,
way that people have configured those services to work.
mm,
Now, some of that might be um, making changes to default configuration, which has made things less secure,
mm,
or it might be not understanding perhaps the initial configuration of
mm.
that and then applying the right controls to make it more secure.
Okay.
And then another key area is around sort of authenticating users and authenticating users really securely.
Mm,
So we've talked previously about things like single factor authentication and multi-factor
mm,
authentication, that kind of thing. Obviously, when you put your services into a cloud
mm,
scenario, generally speaking, not in every case, but generally speaking, these are
mm.
accessible to a large,
Yeah.
a large attack surface with
Mm,
potentially publishing these things to the internet. So ensuring that you're authenticating users securely
hmm.
is really important, and then
Okay.
that forms, those two are key controls really for forming the basis of a
Okay.
secure
And also
platform.
knowing who your users are, and sometimes you have third parties connecting into your cloud environment. They might be there for a 12-month period because they're servicing a contract. What happens after that period? You sort of review um, your sort of user list and make sure that you people who shouldn't be accessing the service don't have access to the service. Do you find
Ye- That
dormant accounts? That's what I'm
that
thinking of.
is
Yeah,
that's a really really good
yeah,
point. So that sort of managing life cycle
yeah,
of
yeah.
accounts and access
Mm,
is really important. So
mm,
yeah, we will find dormant accounts for
mm,
people that have left the organization or
mm-hmm,
third parties that have worked with the organization.
yeah.
I think sort of touching on that area as we move into a more um, hybrid
Mm,
environment in terms of organizations collaborating together,
mm-hmm,
sharing resources. It's really important to not only try and configure those things securely in the first place
Hmm.
and then remove the access when
Right.
they're finished, but also to go through kind of a process of testing and validating that access. So
Mm.
if you're going to provide access to two or three users or
Hmm.
another organization to a
Yeah.
particular data set,
Hmm.
you need to sort of simulate, for example, logging in
Mm.
as a test user from that organization, check what they can see, what they
Yeah.
can't see, go through and validate all the controls are working properly
Mm. Okay.
before you roll that into production,
Mm.
in addition to cleaning up after that
Okay. So there's access
breaches.
controls, authentication. You can also limit where your users can connect in from, can't you? You can sort of use conditional access policies and so on.
Yes, definitely. So when we're talking about authenticating
Mm.
users, there's the sort of username and password element of
Mm.
that. There's the multi-factor authentication element of
Mm.
that. Then there are those additional controls that you're referring to there.
Mm.
So you can build on top of that those kind of additional, more complex policies to
Mm.
say we only want to permit authentication to happen from
Yeah.
these geographical regions. So
Yeah.
these countries.
Okay.
Or maybe from devices that are enrolled and trusted
Mm.
or that have a particular certificate on them. So we can start to build a higher level of trust around
Yeah.
that
Okay.
authentication.
So what's the risk of having poor access control or your authentication mechanisms potentially not being as effective as they should be? So what can happen? What can the bad guys do?
So really what we're talking about here is somebody being able to authenticate as one of your users.
Hmm.
Um, doesn't really matter who that is at this
Mm.
point in time, but if they can authenticate as one of your users,
Hmm.
then they can fundamentally get access to your data.
Mm.
And if that is a privileged user, then they might be able to gain
Okay.
and maintain some level of control over the infrastructure.
Okay. And then in terms of misconfigurations, just some high level risks that you see. So as a result of misconfiguration, and it's a big area, this isn't it? 'Cause it depends on where the misconfiguration is, but what sort of risks would be relevant in the cloud environment as a result of misconfiguration?
Yeah, so there's many different cloud services and
Mm.
many different misconfigurations that could
Mm.
be present for each one. So following the kind of best practice for
Yeah.
deployment helps to protect against those.
Mm.
The kinds of risks that we can see there really is sorts of things like bypassing those controls we were talking about earlier. So,
Mm.
for example, if we're authenticating users really well,
Mm.
but then we place some data in a store, in cloud storage,
Mm.
and then we have the wrong access control applied to the storage,
Mm.
kind of, if you like, on more of the back end of perhaps that
Mm.
application, then a user might be able to access things that are stored within the cloud storage, or an
Okay.
attacker might be able to
Yeah.
access those without even needing to authenticate to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
sort of front end of the
Okay.
application. So really, it allows things like circumventing those
Mm.
controls.
Mm.
Also, we kind of build security in layers.
Right.
So if we've got gaps in terms of configuration,
Mm.
it can allow attackers to find kind of a path through
Right.
your infrastructure,
Okay.
whereas deploying best
Mm.
practices at each level makes that sort of
Yeah.
path much more difficult.
And then there's sort of the human error element. So this is kind of touching on the Gartner point. So how does that play out? So if you're taking control of the cloud environment, so you're more of the responsibilities with you or the client. So you then are perhaps developing some software, some applications, and you're hosting them in the cloud environment. I guess human error is that can creep in, can't it? If you no, you're not necessarily acting maliciously and not configuring it correctly, putting in the right controls and measures and guardrails and so on. But you perhaps don't know, or you make a mistake. So do you see that when you're testing? Are some of the issues related to errors made by humans?
We do see that,
Mm.
yes, and I think the that kind of 99.9%
Mm.
statistic that they've come
Just
out with,
99.
just
Just
99,
99.
okay, just 99. So I think that sort of statistic that they're talking
Yeah.
about there really is probably two things. It's
Mm.
probably sort of misconfiguration, or people not appreciating that they need to configure things in a particular way,
Yeah.
or it's a misunderstanding of where the responsibility of the cloud provider finishes and then the customer starts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's this sort of assumption that because I'm putting it in the cloud, X
It's
or
all
Y
secure.
provider is
Yeah.
dealing with all the security, and exactly,
Yeah.
it's all secure.
Yeah.
And that's, they're dealing with an amount of the security,
Mm.
and then there's an amount of the security that is
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
your responsibility.
Yeah. It's interesting because cloud adoption is still increasing, massively. So these risks are only going to increase in proportion to that. Some of the threats then. So zero-day exploits. So exposing or exploiting vulnerabilities. I mean, how's that relevant in a cloud environment?
So yeah, so when we talk about 0 day, we're talking about newly discovered
Mm.
issues,
Yeah.
which are always going to be sort of difficult to protect against. There's obviously a lot of work that goes into protecting the cloud platform itself from those kinds of attacks. In terms of kind of your exposed applications, what you probably really need to do is to, like we would have done historically on an on-premise infrastructure, is to have an understanding of what the assets look like, what
Yeah.
does the
Yeah.
inventory look like, what is exposed in terms of services,
Yeah.
so that when vulnerabilities are discovered, we can do the right thing to protect them. To protect an application that you're publishing that that might be vulnerable to such an attack, you could use like a cloud security, additional cloud security controls up front of that. So, for example, protecting them, some of the authentication and the web application firewall technology, some of those things that are available can help protect an application perhaps that you've got hosting from a 0 day as well.
And patching is still relevant, isn't it? Because I suppose it depends on who's responsible for the applications. But if it's your application or your server, so you're hosting the server and you're responsible for that server, you're therefore responsible for patching the operating systems and so on.
You are, yeah. So in that infrastructure as a service model, you would be responsible for the server patching. So as well as perhaps the application patching as well. So it's really important that that's maintained and done in a timely manner. We see obviously updates come out all the time, every month. So regularly applying those is just as important in the cloud as it is anywhere else, and it builds part of that defense in depth approach as well.
And then some of the other threats, and just to summarize, so the phishing still applies, APTs, insider threats, I suppose. They're all relevant, aren't they, in a cloud environment?
They're all still relevant. Yes, definitely. I mean, fundamentally, what we've got to remember here is we've still got applications and services and infrastructure. It might be hosted somewhere else. There might be somebody else that's responsible for certain elements. It might be easier for us to deploy some of these things, with sort of automation and code. But fundamentally, we've still got services and servers that are exposed potentially to attack.
So there's lots of benefits of moving to cloud. Resilience, for example, scalability, and depending on the kind of service you consume, it is going to be far more secure than you can do it internally, because the resources that AWS or Microsoft are able to deploy are going to be far greater than we're going to be able to just deploy, or a client is. Well, what we're saying is that you've got to remember where the responsibility is, because risks still apply, and there are threats that are relevant. So moving on to what your team does then. So you have a service in your team that you conduct in terms of assessing cloud security assessments. So let's just talk a little bit about how that works then. So are there different types of assessments you do, or on different types of clouds, or is there a standard model for this?
So there's standard principles
Okay.
for cloud assessment, and then there are specific considerations for different types of cloud and different vendors of cloud. So there's those general cloud principles kind of consider all of the aspects. So things like data in transit protection. Okay. So those apply broadly. And then when we look at a particular level of use, so maybe that's infrastructure as a service or software as a service, that affects maybe how that is assessed.
Okay.
And then also when we talk about specific vendors of cloud technologies, whether that's Microsoft's Azure offering, Amazon's AWS, etc., they've got their own different security offerings and sort of best practice configurations. So it's a combination of those things that are matched to the customer's use of cloud.
Okay. So let's talk about the methodology you follow then. So starting from the point where you sort of start your scoping exercise. Let's start there. So how does that work? How do you scope a cloud security assessment?
So the key thing really for us to do is to understand that organization's use of cloud technology, so we can understand, what the exposure is. So what types of, what vendors might they be using? What types of technology are they using? How is that exposed? And what's that general level of maturity in terms of configuration? What that will do is then allow us to tailor that cloud assessment and the scope, well, the scoping conversation, and then the cloud assessment into that technology that they're using. So we can then steer towards a given vendor and level of use. So, for example, an assessment for a SaaS product, a software as a service product, would be very different, perhaps, to an assessment of a infrastructure as a service platform that's running hundreds of servers.
Right. So you've defined the scope, working with the client. You've identified the kind of service it is. What happens next?
So the team will then look at that scope and they'll evaluate it. So, for example, we'll look at so we take the example first of all of like an application. So 365, we'd be looking at what particular applications are in use by that organization, and then we'll review the security best practice configuration for each of those applications. And then we might look at specific sort of test scenarios. So, for example, we might have different users in different sort of user profiles, user groups, maybe where there's data in for one group of users that shouldn't be accessible to another group of users, and we'll work through exactly that. So separation. So we'll work through some specific cases. So we'll aim to define what those look like during the scoping phase with the organisation. And then we can test out those cases during the assessment. So that's kind of a couple of examples there, really, for sort of a SaaS product.
So if the client's got some security concerns, you can build those into your scope and test those security concerns.
Yes, definitely. So during those scoping conversations, we'll always ask, what are your security concerns? What keeps you awake at night? What are you worried about? Or where do you feel you're exposed? Those allow us to kind of tailor at least some of those objectives within the assessment to addressing those concerns, because sometimes people are worried about them unnecessarily, and sometimes that they're exactly right. Those are the things that they really need to be concerned about. And to be honest, either way, it doesn't really matter, because if they're worried about them, we need to address that and get to a point of knowing the fact, because that will give them that reassurance.
So just a slight kind of side question. So if you're testing a 365 environment or an AWS environment, you obviously have to get authorization from the client? Do you have to get authorization from Microsoft or from AWS?
So that varies from cloud provider to cloud provider. So they've each got their own sort of specific policy around testing, and it also depends on which bit of the infrastructure is being tested. So without kind of going into the specifics of any one, if you're testing services that effectively are the customer services running in the cloud platform, that might have a different set of requirements and controls and considerations around it to if you were wanting to test the underlying shared service of the public cloud, if that makes sense. So Some cloud providers will restrict you from doing certain
Yeah,
tests.
yeah.
Some will
Okay,
allow
so
it,
it
but there
depends on
are.
what the scope is essentially.
It does,
Okay,
and the individual provider.
okay. So you've got the scope. You've defined any primary security concerns or security concerns that the client's got. So you then start your testing. Yeah, obviously there's lots of sort of there's calls with the client, engagement calls, scoping calls, prerequisite calls, just to set the scene and
Yeah.
expectations.
So all of those assessments, after we've obviously sort of initially scoped it
Yeah,
and gone through that commercial stage,
yeah,
then we'll do an initial planning call with the customer to
yeah.
work out, this is
Mm,
the plan, the
mm,
assessment, these are the dates, this is the methodology, this is
mm,
the approach. Um, ensure that all those reporting kind of processes and points of contact are all clear before we get started.
okay.
Um, during the assessment, we'll then go through um, those pieces that have been agreed. So
Mm,
whether that is looking at sort of goals and objectives and principal security concerns and
mm,
sort of performing, whether that's like a penetration test style
mm,
assessment on a cloud hosted service,
yeah.
or whether that's a best practice
Okay.
configuration review.
Mm,
Um, we'll go through that and then
mm,
reporting regularly to the customer at kind of
okay. And if you
a
find
key
anything
milestone.
that's critical, obviously you'll inform the client straight away so they can do something about it.
Yeah, so we do.
Standard, isn't it?
Yeah, we do a kind of a mixed reporting
Mm,
method. So anything that's critical will be in touch straight away.
mm,
Anything that needs to be addressed but isn't super critical, then
mm,
we'll report that either at the end of each day
yeah.
or at the end of the project,
Mm,
depending on the client's preference.
okay.
And then obviously all of those assessments are backed up with a full detailed report
Mm,
at the close of the project anyway.
okay. And you can walk through the report with the client, um,
100%.
and then there's a
Yeah.
remediation action plan and so on. So, so we've talked a little bit about cloud and we've kind of defined it, sort of thing. And we've also talked about the risks and we've talked about the assessment. So, client might be thinking, well, we're paying the provider all this money. Why do we need to assess it? Aren't they assessing it? Why should a client? Because it costs money to do a cloud security assessment, doesn't it? So why and under what circumstances should a client conduct a cloud security assessment?
So to address the why, first of all,
Yeah.
it comes down to that responsibility,
Mm,
that shared responsibility model.
hmm.
So um, the client is doing that assessment because they're doing it on the elements that are their responsibility
Hmm.
fundamentally. So the
Okay.
cloud provider's responsibility stops at a certain point.
Yeah.
And when we get to that assumption that because it's in the cloud, it's secure,
Mm,
that's kind of the root of that problem. So
hmm.
what we're doing there is we're assessing the area that the client's responsible for
Mm,
to try and help close that potential gap
okay.
to ensure that that is okay.
Is that more relevant for services that are hosted within AWS and Azure, as opposed to, and there are others obviously, as opposed to SaaS-based services like 365, for example? Would you conduct an assessment on a 365 environment?
So we do conduct assessments on those environments.
Right.
We conduct them all the time.
Okay.
I think the key thing to remember is that when you're using kind of an infrastructure as a service
Hmm.
cloud platform, there are more components there
Right.
to ensure are configured correctly
Mm,
because you're responsible for more components within the
yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
So that type of assessment is really important because we need to look at things like
Mm,
network security and access controls on
hmm.
networks and servers and
Mm,
applications and users.
hmm.
There's loads of components there.
Okay.
When we get into SaaS products,
Mm,
there are still considerations there. We've
mm,
still got user accounts, we've still got
mm,
authentication, we've
yeah.
still got, you know, applications that have got access control configuration, whether
Mm,
that's, a web application or whether that's a
yeah.
backend
Okay.
database.
So it's a complex environment, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Mm,
There's still things to consider there.
right. Okay. So just to finish off then, Rob, would you give our listeners and viewers some tips that they can take away to help secure their cloud environment? So just some general tips, perhaps some do's and don'ts. What would you advise they do?
Definitely. So there's some really key kind of fundamentals that we can look at here.
Okay.
So the first thing really is to know what you've got deployed in the cloud. It sounds like a really obvious thing, but unfortunately, as you sort of find out when you're working with customers and go through these scoping stages, people don't necessarily know. So having a good understanding of what you've got is key. Also, which components of that are exposed then to untrusted networks like the internet. That's kind of a secondary thing. That's really important. Then rolling out your secure authentication. So ensuring that you close up things like single factor authentication. If you've got any other services that use authentication as well, like APIs, that kind of thing, you want to know about that. And then ensure that you've got that robust model around security updates and patching, especially in those sort of IaaS, lower level cloud offerings. Just keeping up to date with those things is really important.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, we're just focusing on the technical element of this, but there's the whole security kind of risk wrap around this as well, isn't there? Make sure you do risk assess your environment.
Of course.
And the data that you put into that, the content that you kind of host in that cloud environment, and make sure you risk assess that. And the same rules apply if you're hosting personal information in the cloud compared to hosting them on prem. You got here we have your GDPR, UK Data Protection Act. So there's all of that to consider as well, which is a whole different podcast.
There is definitely all of that.
Yeah. Okay. That's brilliant, Rob. Thank you for that. So we've given some tips there to take away. Any final words? Anything you want to add in summary around cloud?
No, I don't think so.
That's great. That's great. So thank you for listening, folks. Like and subscribe, and give us some feedback. Any comments around anything that you want us to talk about in future podcasts, or any comments around what we've talked about today. Any feedback would be really useful for us to as we go into other podcasts. And that's all for now. See you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to our cybersecurity podcast. If you're keen to learn more, please visit our website www.aristi.co.uk. Cybersecurity made simple.